Hit by a funding shortfall, a UN body responsible for investigating Israeli violence in the occupied territories says the shortage is hampering its work. So what does this mean for securing justice and holding Israel to account? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. An independent commission of inquiry investigating violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territories warns its work will now be limited. Severe funding shortages are derailing the body established by the UN Human Rights Council in 2021. The US withdrew from the council earlier this year in a repeat of what Donald Trump did during his first term. Now his administration owes $1.5 billion in fees to the UN, where significant budget cuts are looming. What then is the impact on this commission in the face of rapidly increasing Israeli settler violence and the illegal expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank? And will this liquidity crunch ultimately shield Israel from further scrutiny on the world stage? We'll try to answer some of those questions with our guests in just a moment, but first this report from Michael Apple.
Israeli settler violence and the establishment of illegal outposts and settlements has been part of Palestinian life in the occupied West Bank for decades. But it was after an Israeli assault on Gaza in 2021 that the UN Human Rights Council established an open-ended, independent international commission of inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory. Its goal? To investigate violations of international humanitarian law leading up to and since the 13th of April that year. 2 years after its establishment, reported violations of international law only escalated. The UN found that in the months before the October 7 attack that year, the Israeli army had already killed 234 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and settlers another 9 people. Save the Children found 2023 to be the deadliest on record for children in the occupied West Bank, with Israeli forces killing an average of more than 1 child a week. In June last year, the then chair of the commission, Navi Pillay, who subsequently resigned alongside 2 remaining commissioners in July, said the situation in Gaza had overshadowed what Israel was doing in the occupied West Bank.
Where Palestinian fatalities recorded since 7th October have exceeded any other recorded period. This is linked to increasingly militarized Israeli operations, as well as a surge in violent settler attacks on Palestinian communities.
As you know, Trump's return to the White House in January saw the US withdraw again from the UN Human Rights Council. Once the biggest donor to the UN, the Trump administration has shut off its funding and owes $1.5 billion in mandatory fees to the UN. While the war in Gaza surpasses 22 months, the situation in the occupied West Bank is rapidly deteriorating. These 2 US senators, who visited the site of a recent Israeli settler attack on a church, want Washington to do more.
We therefore have a responsibility to use that leverage, to use that connection to say that starvation of people in Gaza is unacceptable, and that violence on the West Bank against Palestinians is unacceptable.
The Netanyahu government has done nothing to rein in violent settlers, and in fact they've been complicit in allowing these attacks to continue.
Beset by a funding crisis, the UN has been forced to cut up to 20% of its budget, and bodies like the Human Rights Council say they're only able to employ half of the investigators needed, hampering current and future inquiries. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So let's discuss all this further with our guests today. And in Glasgow, in Scotland, we have Andrew Gilmour, a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. In the occupied West Bank, Sari Bashi, a human rights lawyer and founder of Gisha, an Israeli human rights organisation. And in Winchester in the UK, William Schabas, Professor of International Law at Middlesex University and a former chairperson of the Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza conflict. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, William, and picking up on that point, your previous job. So you headed a Commission of Inquiry on the war in 2014. In 2021, after the fourth Gaza war, we are now in the fifth Gaza war, which has gone on nearly for 2 years. It was decided not just to have a Commission of Inquiry on the war, but to have an ongoing permanent Commission of Inquiry that would look not just at Gaza and the West Bank. Just explain to us how this COI, Commission of Inquiry, is different from the one that you led.
Well, I think the main difference is that the new Commission of Inquiry, the one that's presided over by Navi Pillay, at least for the coming months, I think she's already going to step down at some point soon. But they have a broad mandate, much broader than we did. And they have, of course, I think this is the biggest difference, a crisis of proportions that we did not even imagine in 2014. In 2014, in the Gaza war, which lasted over several weeks, there were about 2,000 deaths. Perhaps 1,500 of them were civilians. And obviously, this is a different order of magnitude than what we see today. Can I just make one point, James, as well, about the commissions of inquiry that I don't think the public is all that aware of? But people work on these as commissioners without remuneration. Navi Pillay has been doing this job with her two colleagues without remuneration. And what we need the money for from the budget is to support the staff, to pay for travel and the other expenses. But there's a huge contribution being made by people who are committed to human rights, who work on these projects like the Commission of Inquiry.
Sari, I mean, a Commission of Inquiry like this, what can it achieve? Because there have been commissions of inquiry on all sorts of things through the UN's history. But the problem with this one is even before it starts getting hampered by budget cuts, it can't go where you are. It can't go to the West Bank. It can't send people to Gaza because Israel won't let it in.
So I agree that there are many limitations on the ability of the Commission to do its work. But at the same time, I think it's very important to have independent fact-finding because the facts are so contested and the facts are weaponized. In a situation like Gaza, where you have use of starvation as a weapon of war, where you have genocide taking place, you also have a narrative in many Western halls of power that does not reflect what's happening on the ground. And so it is, even if the members cannot come and be present, in the past we've had human rights organizations, victims leave and meet them in Jordan and lots of other places. It probably adds to the cost, but that's just part of the cost of doing this very important business of presenting independent fact-finding.
Andrew, I mean, you were the former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, but you had a 30-year career in the United Nations. How worried are you about the wider effects of budget cuts on human rights? Because all of the UN's budgets are being cut because, in part, because the US has pulled out so much of its money. And of course, it means human rights has to compete with other things like humanitarian matters. And yes, there may be different budgets for some of those, but if it's choosing between feeding people and doing inquiries, it's a very difficult choice for the UN, isn't it?
Yes, it is a difficult choice, but can I say it is both a real financial crisis and also an artificial financial crisis. Let me explain. The UN is meant to have three pillars: peace and security, including peacekeeping, development, and human rights. But of those three pillars, human rights gets under 4% of the revenue. So it's not as if you're taking money away from feeding children to putting it into an inquiry. It is true, and it is absolutely shocking that in a state of what is, by almost any definition, genocide, but under no circumstance it could even be disputed that it's serial war crimes across the board. But at this time, the UN is being starved of resources to do the human rights work, and that is absolutely outrageous. But what makes it artificial is that states can donate. And I can tell you, the time I'm taking to speak this one sentence, if the Arab states use the revenues that they are earning in this one sentence, they would cover the cost of the Commission of Inquiry. That is literally the case. And you could resolve that case immediately and have the Commission of Inquiry back to work. If states decide not to give voluntary contributions to the UN human rights mechanisms, then that is their choice. But it's certainly not the UN's fault, by the way. They are true when they say, they're speaking truthfully when they say the money's run out. But it's the fault of the member states who could easily, and we're talking about such small sums, they could easily put them back on the road.
Andrew, I remember when you finished your service at the UN, because you actually did an interview with me at Al Jazeera, and at the time you talked about the deliberate humiliation of the Palestinians, words which are, very, very key now when you look at what has happened and what has happened in Gaza now for nearly 2 years. You, in addition to your previous job at the UN, are leading a new body called UN for Gaza. Can you briefly tell us what you're trying to achieve there?
Yes, it's a totally unofficial organization. It's set up by a number of current staff who are feeling very understandably outraged, angry, disempowered, but also feel tremendous solidarity with their colleagues, UN colleagues who working under such unspeakable conditions in the West Bank and also Gaza. So it's a group of people. I don't think it's ever been done in the 80-year history before, whereupon a group of staff want to set up such an organization. And they have a few, such as me, I'm the chair, they asked me to be, and a few other senior officials from the past to provide them with some advice and to give them some guidance as to how to work on some things. So it's a way for staff who feel so appalled by the fact that so many UN staff have been deliberately killed by the Israelis in the last couple of years, that and there's so little outrage, even though these staff are killed carrying out their tasks that are mandated by the UN member states. But those UN member states seem to not care at all. And there's been so little outrage expressed over the killing of these UN staff. But so the current staff in other duty stations around the world, we're talking about New York, Geneva, even some in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, all over the world, there are people who want to be able to help and seeing what they can do. That's the point of that unofficial organization that I'm now the chair of.
Sari, in terms of the new work the Commission of Inquiry wanted to do, which is not being given the funding for, it was a request from Pakistan, which is on the Human Rights Council, to look into arms transfers to Israel, number one, and Israeli settler violence. How key would that research have been? And the findings, of course.
Yeah, it's very important because two key asks that human rights advocates are making of countries around the world, but in particularly in the West, is to stop providing arms to the Israeli military because they're being used to commit grave abuses against Palestinians, and also to use their mechanisms to impose individual sanctions, including against violent settlers. I agree with Andrew that it would be easy for wealthy Gulf countries, for other countries to fund this, and they should. But I would prefer that countries like Pakistan, countries in the Gulf, would provide general funding to the Human Rights Council. Because when countries fund particular projects on the Human Rights Council, it runs the risk of allowing them to be selective. We are against human rights by this actor, but not by another. And so my call would be for those members to restore full funding to the Human Rights Council so that those experts can independently decide how to use those resources rather than it being limited to pet projects. I do think there are also things that individual states can do. Most states, including in Europe, have atrocity prevention mechanisms that include fact-finding mechanisms. And so there's nothing to prevent them from doing their own inquiries, both into the role that their arms transfers are playing in fueling grave abuses, as well as into looking at what individual sanctions they should be slapping on violent settlers in the West Bank.
William, I'd like you to pick up that point on individual states choosing particular projects they want to fund. Do you think that's a good thing or not? Because I hear that among the wider cuts, there was plans for a new commission of inquiry on the Democratic Republic of Congo. That is on ice now. And also there was a plan for a new mechanism, I hate these UN words, but mechanism or fact-finding mission on Afghanistan. That's on hold, but I hear the European countries might want to fund that specifically. Is this a good thing, countries choosing projects that they want to pursue?
Basically, it isn't a good thing. I would love for some wealthy country to write a nice big check for Navi Pillay so that the Commission of Inquiry on Gaza can continue with its work. But absolutely, this is it's a deep flaw, not just at the United Nations, but also, for example, at the International Criminal Court, which also accepts voluntary contributions from states, and they distort the priorities of the court by giving contributions that are directed at one situation rather than at another, so that loads of money has poured into the International Criminal Court to do investigations in Ukraine into Russian war crimes, but not the same amount of money to deal with Palestine.
Andrew, let's talk about commissions of inquiry and the courts. Is there a duplication here, or do they work well together?
I'm sure there are some areas that perhaps slightly duplicate, but broadly speaking, that's not the problem, James. The problem is the lack of willingness of the Israelis to allow any of them to operate, any of them to enter in the country. I mean, the problem is not the duplication. One can always say, oh, the UN's inefficient, the UN, there are many flaws to it. But focusing on that, I think, wouldn't take us very far. There is vital work to be done by the International Criminal Court, by the Commission of Inquiry, by the International Court of Justice, by the Human Rights Council. There is a lot that can be done. There's a lot. It is important for all of it to be done, and all of it is being blocked at the moment. But as I said, some of it is artificial blocking. It would take a click of a finger to allow money to go to the Commission of Inquiry from even one member state, let alone a group of rich member states.
So, Sari, in terms of all the different efforts for accountability that are going on, you have this Commission of Inquiry, clearly hampered now by funding, but hampered before because Israel won't let it in. You have the International Criminal Court, sanctioned by the United States. You have the International Court of Justice, which has made rulings, but they are being ignored. And you have the UN Security Council blocked by veto. Who is going to hold Israel to account for its crimes in Gaza?
I mean, the situation is terrible, but I think there are also opportunities to build back the multilateral system of accountability in a different and maybe a better way. Up until now, the UN and other institutions have been dominated by the global north in ways that have been hard and have set the wrong priorities at a time when global north countries are pulling funding, and it is not a good thing that they are pulling funding. But if they are, there's an opportunity for global south countries to step up and to increase their contributions to the UN, increase their contributions to regional systems like the African Union, like other mechanisms that can help advance human rights around the world at a regional level. And I think that could change the priorities of the multilateral global system so that it could be fairer and less selective. It's going to take a lot of time, and the damage is real right now. And so in the meantime, as a stopgap, states should use the individual mechanisms that are at their disposal, in particular suspending trade agreements with Israel, stopping military assistance, and using individual targeted sanctions where possible.
William, it's the 80th anniversary of the UN system, of the formal order that came after World War II. And yet we have what is going on in Gaza, what I think could be termed a massacre every single day. Has the system we've known completely collapsed now?
Well, I don't think that's the right word or the right way to view it. Where it's challenged now, and it's challenged because of what it's been capable of doing and the importance. You know, we mentioned the commissions of inquiry. I wouldn't be dismissive of how significant they are. They get quoted in judgments. They get quoted in applications for arrest warrants. They get used and invoked by lawyers in domestic courts to stop arms transfers and so on. They are very, very powerful and influential institutions. But your broader question about the UN, I mean, it's a question of whether the glass is half full or glass empty right now, or maybe to paraphrase Winston Churchill, you know, it's the worst institution except for the alternative, What do we have? It's an absolutely vital institution. The architecture of the UN handicaps it hugely, and that's a consequence of 1945. And that's why, for example, Palestine should be a member of the United Nations. Everybody voted in favor of it, except for the United States through its veto, which blocked the possibility of Palestine joining the UN. So these are some of the challenges we face, but I wouldn't be, it's a great anniversary, the 80th anniversary, and we have to struggle to make the UN better.
Andrew, in terms of what happened 80 years ago, the UN Charter, the system was set up. A few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a very bold document which said that everyone was born free and equal in dignity and rights. That passed. 58 members of the UN at the time, 48 voted in favour, no one voted against, the others either abstained or didn't vote. Tell me what your feeling is now on where the members of the General Assembly stand on human rights, particularly the big members of the United Nations, the powerful countries, the US, China and Russia. Is that a worrying picture? And I'll just add a hypothetical question at the end. If we hadn't had a Universal Declaration of Human Rights and it was a draft document now, do you think it would pass?
No, it probably wouldn't pass. Some very big countries, and you just mentioned three, are currently deeply hostile even to the conception of human rights. The Americans may say they're not. The Chinese may say they're not. The Russians may say they're not, but they are, all three of them. And they would certainly do what they can to block progress. By the way, in that same 12-month period, there was the Convention on Genocide, which obliges member states to take action to prevent. And that seems to be the key one at the moment that is being flagrantly ignored. I believe, and I've said, what we are seeing at the moment is the cruelest and most extreme example of double standards in my lifetime. There is going to be, I don't know when it'll be, there is going to be a huge bill to settle for that. There is going to be, obviously, in the first place, the Israelis who are carrying it out. Secondly, the Americans who have given them a total green light and the weaponry to do it. Thirdly, the Europeans, who are the biggest trade partner of Israel, but have systematically done pretty little to ensure that it is being stopped. They say a few things, and I'm glad that some of them are now recognizing Palestine years too late, but still that they're making some progress. But they're not the only guilty ones as well. There are also countries who speak the same language as the Palestinians. What are they doing? I can tell you that the foreign ministries of the Americans, of the US and the Western countries are not feeling pressure from the Arab world. They're not here. They're not saying, guys, we need to stop this. They're not using the immense leverage. This is a US administration that has, more than any US administration in history, a sort of adulation of money. The leverage that the Gulf states have over this group of people running the Trump administration has been unequaled. They are doing major business with major figures in the Gulf and even kings. They could use their leverage. The Trump administration would listen to them. According to them, the Americans, according to the Europeans, they're not really hearing this message. And I think that too is not going to be forgotten, and there will be a reckoning for that too.
Sari, is the UN leadership also not doing enough? There was an article from Martin Griffiths, the former humanitarian chief of the United Nations, in The Guardian newspaper, and he said that the lack of relevance of the UN stems from a collapse in the UN's most precious resource, its courage, the courage to lead. Should the UN be speaking out more than it is?
I mean, look, I'm aware of a lot of attempts from the Secretary General, from various rapporteurs, from various organs of the UN, including the WHO, which is doing incredibly brave work right now, to speak out and to speak out with courage. Could they do more? We all need to do more. There's a genocide going on. We all need to do more to stop it, because every day is very costly. But I also think that it's a chance to look at this reckoning that Andrew discussed, and I agree with him 100%. There is going to be a reckoning in Europe, in the United States, in the Middle East, where governments are going to be held accountable by their citizens, by the people who they supposedly represent, for their inactivity and in many cases complicity in very grave abuses that are being live streamed from Gaza. And my hope is that that reckoning will lead to significant policy changes, if not regime changes in many places, that could help reshape the UN.
William, the UN Secretary General hasn't spoken to, or certainly he will not speak to him. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has not taken his calls in 22 months. Secretary General Antonio Guterres hasn't managed to speak to Trump since he became president again on the 20th of January. Is the UN becoming marginalised and irrelevant?
Well, it's certainly quite dire when the Secretary General can't get the ear of these important political figures. You know, a minute ago, you mentioned the three big countries that you said were no longer were hostile to human rights. You left out two important ones. You left out the United Kingdom and France. Part of this reckoning has to come with the Europeans, who have kind of reveled in their reputation for promoting human rights around the world through the EU, through their foreign policy and so on. And I think they are the ones who are going to be completely discredited now. This is one of the consequences of their silence to a large extent about genocide in Gaza and their contribution to it through the provision of arms, diplomatic support, financial support, political support for the state of Israel as it carries out this atrocity.
Thank you, William, and thank you to all our guests today, Andrew Gilmour, Sari Bashi and William Schabas. You can watch Inside Story on television or whenever you want on YouTube or at our website, aljazeera.com. We always like to hear from you too. Post your comments on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or join the conversation on X. Find us at AJ Inside Story. For now, from me, James Bays, and all the team in Doha, stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.